of the public, all stakeholders that might be in attendance, and the support staff of all the 4 committees on finance of Parliament. A very good morning to you and welcome to the meeting. We are not going to make any opening remarks. I am with the 4 chairpersons of committees on finance. At my far left is Honorable Maimane, the chairperson on the Standing Committee on Appropriations from the National Assembly. And then next to him is Dr. Maswangani, a Standing Committee on Finance chairperson from the National Assembly. Next to me is Honorable Ndlovu, a chairperson on the Select Committee on Finance, and myself, Honorable Lekwase, a chairperson on the Select Committee on Appropriations. Both of us are from the NCOP. I am not going to take long in opening the meeting. We have a long engagement today with the minister, and our intention is to be mindful of time, as our meeting has been set for 3 hours, which is from 10 o'clock until 1 o'clock. I am going to request that we do not take any round of introductions, as there's many of us. Anybody who make a submission or asks the question, they will introduce themselves during the deliberations. Welcome again into the meeting. This meeting will be focusing only on the briefing by the Minister of Finance on the 2025 budget that he has tabled before Parliament on the 12th of March. I will therefore, without any waste of time, hand over to the Minister to lead the presentation, and he will indicate on how the team from the National Treasury will be taking us through the presentations. And then later I will allow members to engage on the presentation, ask questions, and make any comments they might want to make towards the presentation on the budget, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you very much. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you, chairpersons of the NCOP, Appropriation and SCOF. Thank you for the opportunity to find the time to, I'm going to ask the DG to take us through, but I want to make some few comments. The first one, with challenges as a nation, part of those challenges is the erosion and the capacity of our social service to be able to meet the needs, particularly of our poor communities. We make the point, for instance, in the respect to health, that just between March and December last year, we lost roughly about 9,000 professionals. And those professional positions could not be filled. We're going to another year where we should be employing more professionals. What this budget is attempting is to grapple with that question. To grapple with that question. You will be aware that we've had doctors, unemployed doctors, marching to everybody's office. The last march was to my office. Expressing a need to provide this needed service to our communities. It's not about employment, it's about to provide a service which is needed to our communities. The health budget had been so eroded, as I indicated, that the accruals amounted to 21 billion. Now, if all of us here as honorable members, we care about these poor communities whose services have been eroded, it's going to be important that irrespective of where we stand on a number of things, we keep our eyes on the ball. And so how do we address that issue? It may well be from a different eye, we have not addressed it. As long as the debate is going to be, we must be addressing these needs of our people, but how do, the key question, how? We may have taken a route which, in these circumstances, colleagues may differ. A tax raising taxes. The similar exercise in education. If you live in KZN, you must know that already KZN was intending to match to protect existing teachers. We may disagree, colleagues, I'm telling you about methodologies and other things, but I don't think we'll disagree on the substantive nature of what we're attempting to resolve. On what we're attempting to resolve. Our defense force lack of funding became clear during the DRC problem. We can't continue in that way. I'm citing but a few examples of what we're trying to grapple with, colleagues. Poor communities use communitary. One of the things we're doing in this budget is to invest much, particularly on signaling, to reduce the time for the train. For poor communities, we make this thing in the statement that if you are in Naledi now, you will have a train in every 10 minutes. If you are in Khayelitsha, you will have a train in every 10 minutes. That's our ambition. And I made the point that the World Bank study shows that one of the difference between if you run for round a South African worker and a South Korean worker, the difference in terms of disposable income is because the South African worker pays a lot on transport. So I thought I should make those remarks as far as the teacher is going to present to understand where we are heading to. We may be taking a wrong direction but we might understand where we're heading to. That's what we want members to appreciate. Thank you very much. DJ.
Thank you very much. Over to you, DJ.
Thank you, Honourable Chairs. Good morning to you and the Honourable Members and all the colleagues here today. My name is Duncan Peters. I'm the DG of the Treasury. The presentation, as the Minister has indicated, sets out a budget that we believe is a budget that sets the scene for us to be able to invest in the right kind of things for faster growth. So we always start this presentation with the economic outlook. We'll talk about how the various strategic investments in infrastructure can support job creation and growth. We will also then indicate what all of this means for the fiscal framework, and then of course articulate the decisions that are being taken on the tax and the spending side and what that then means for the fiscal framework. The next slide shows the global growth outlook. We always start putting together a fiscal framework with our macroeconomic forecast, and the starting point of that forecast is what's going to happen to global growth. So in the near term, we expect global growth to remain stable at 3.3%, which is below the historical average, and there are quite significant regional differences. In the US, for example, they are experiencing upward revisions to growth, while in the euro area, they are challenging with growth because of their own geopolitical tensions as well as the broader global uncertainty. Inflation has continued to ease, but in many parts of the developed world in particular, structural constraints such as low productivity and aging populations limit their long-term growth potential. On the next slide, we go into the South African forecast for growth. We project growth of 1.9% in 2025 from a revised estimate of 0.6% in 2024. This growth does reflect weaker than expected GDP outcomes in both the third and the fourth quarters. We expect growth to average 1.8% from 2025 to 2027. Household consumption has been revised lower, while gross fixed capital formation or investment and government consumption is revised higher. We will, of course, also incorporate in future growth forecasts the outcome of the fourth quarter GDP numbers, which were released a week before we tabled the budget. The next slide then just outlines the risks. On the domestic side, logistics challenges remain a constraint. There are some unfunded spending pressures that we are concerned about. In particular, the minister would have spoken in previous engagements around things like PEPFAR, which have not entered the fiscal framework yet, as it were. Faster than expected easing in interest rates and inflation is an upside risk, potentially, because that would boost consumer spending. There are some potential also positive upside risks from domestic food prices that could benefit from a recovery there. And on the revenue side, greater than anticipated withdrawals from two-pot retirement would lead to higher than anticipated levels of both consumption and revenue. On the global side, there are heightened concerns over escalating protectionist risks and geopolitical tensions and what that means for global growth, as well as commodity prices. A strong US dollar may cause capital outflows, although, interestingly, the rand remains one of the best performing emerging market currencies against the dollar, which of course for us helps because it limits imported inflation and therefore keeps prices in South Africa lower. There are some limited upside risks globally also from the implementation of structural reforms in other parts of the world. The next slide then outlines our medium-term economic strategy, which is anchored by 4 pillars or 4 priorities. First, maintaining macroeconomic stability and reducing volatility to reduce the cost of living and encourage investment. How? Because if you have macroeconomic stability in place, you will benefit from lower interest rates and therefore lower cost of capital and lower cost of borrowing, which supports investment. Implementing structural reforms is the second pillar and remains important in order to promote a competitive economy while addressing the various constraints to job creation. Building state capability is a very important priority, in particular for Operation Vulindlela Phase 2, which will focus, amongst other things, on digital transformation. And then finally, and the slides will talk to this in greater detail, infrastructure investment, and we'll return to that later. The next slide then just summarizes the one key pillar of the growth agenda, which is structural reforms. In phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela, we will be following through on some of the existing reforms in electricity and logistics in particular, but there are also some new priorities for phase 2. On the local government side, institutional governance and financial reforms to address the root causes of deteriorating performance and service delivery at a municipal level. On the spatial inequality side, creating dynamic cities through things like resolving the title deeds challenges, resolving some of the land use and permitting related issues, as well as significant investments in commuter rail, which the minister spoke to earlier. And then on the digital transformation side, there are significant investments in digital public infrastructure that's being planned. On the next slide, we then talk to our fiscal strategy and the key components of that strategy. First, strengthening fiscal sustainability and accountability. The government is committed to ensuring that we have a growing primary budget surplus, which is the budget balance that excludes debt service costs or interest payments, of 0.5% this year, rising to 0.9% in 25-26. And we published a document on fiscal anchors to start a conversation, a broader conversation about how to ensure that we can improve the long-run sustainability of our fiscus. Secondly, on the tax policy side, we are proposing 28 billion rand in additional tax revenue measures in 25-26 and an additional 14 billion in 26-27, and we'll go through those tax measures in detail later. We are also expecting 4 billion rand in revenue from the sale of strategic oil reserves, which will flow into the National Revenue Fund in 25-26. On the infrastructure side, we'll go through that in more detail later, but we are adding or proposing to add 46.7 billion to infrastructure plans. This is a key part of the growth agenda. And then finally, a sustainable public service wage agreement, which will add certainty for the next 3 years due to the 3-year nature of that agreement. Public servants will receive 5.5% wage increase in 25-26, which will exceed inflation, and then CPI-linked increases in the 2 outer years. This wage agreement will cost the government an additional 7.3 billion in 25-26, and then 8.2 billion by 27-28. The next slide then talks to the plans on infrastructure, which is a very important pillar in our view of unlocking growth and job creation because of how labor intensive, in particular, the construction sector is and the very high employment multipliers there. Over the next 3 years, just over 1 trillion is being allocated to public infrastructure, with very large allocations to roads, 402 billion, energy, 220 billion, and water and sanitation, 156 billion over the medium term. And the budget then proposes additional funding of 46.7 billion for infrastructure projects over the medium term. There are also some institutional reforms that are being finalized. We are establishing a single structure in the National Treasury in 25-26 to coordinate state participation in project preparation, planning, PPPs, funding, and credit guarantees. We are bringing together various bits of project preparation, capacity support in GTAC, the PPP unit, and the DBSA, so that we can strengthen the quality and the depth of the infrastructure pipeline. When we talk to the funders in the infrastructure space, there's a lot of appetite, in particular, from the banks and other financial institutions to invest in infrastructure, but the problem is the project pipeline. On the PPP side, public-private partnerships, the PPP regulations have now been finalized and published and streamlined, and they have reduced approval requirements for projects below 2 billion. We have also established a framework, or we have allowed in these regulations for a framework to be established to process unsolicited PPP proposals or bids from the private sector. A lot of entities have called for that because they don't currently have a way of processing unsolicited bids. And the BFI, the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, has approved a further 9 projects worth 55 billion over the next few years, 15.3 billion of which will be funded by the BFI. We are also this year replacing the 1 BFI window with 4 windows. So we will now be giving departments and entities 4 opportunities per year to submit their projects for funding. And we believe that will really assist with the infrastructure pipeline. And then finally, the budget proposes a performance-based conditional grant for trading services or trading entities at a municipal level that provide basic services such as municipal water. And this grant will incentivize financial and operational reforms to improve the functioning of these entities. Turning now to the first part of the fiscal framework on the next slide, which is the changes in tax policy. The minister spoke about the various spending pressures in the system, and it is our view that an increase in the spending has to be accompanied by an increase in revenue in order for the government to maintain its commitment to fiscal sustainability, including a rising primary surplus and stabilizing debt in 25-26. The minister spoke about what some of these are, and while this budget includes a mixture of tax measures, it does still consider that a VAT increase will be indispensable for raising the additional revenue. On the next slide, we talk about what some of those medium-term expenditure adjustments are. The 2025 budget proposes additional spending pressures to be funded of 232 billion over the medium term. And we can see what those additions to baselines are in the table on the slide that's currently being projected. Firstly, about 46 billion, as we indicated earlier, to infrastructure. Secondly, 23.3 billion to fund the wage agreement that was signed a few weeks ago. An additional 11 billion is being proposed for early retirement. There are a number of departments, such as the Department of Defense and Correctional Services, where they cannot afford the current employees on their structures. And so we believe, in consultation with these departments, that making a provision for early retirement without penalties to your pension fund, as well as an incentive for early retirement, will help these departments to readjust their employee budgets and rejuvenate those departments by bringing in new employees. All of the savings that departments will get from early retirement will be retained by those departments, so they will not flow back to the fiscus. And secondly, early retirement is only possible with the permission of the accounting officer or the executive authority. So departments will have the final say in deciding who actually leaves. Another 35 billion rand appropriation is proposed for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. The honourable members will notice that in 26-27 and 27-28, there is no appropriation being proposed for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. But there is, however, a provisional allocation in the fiscal framework for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. So it is funded for the next 3 years. The only reason it's not there is because the second 2 years is a provisional allocation in the fiscal framework. And that's because of the ongoing work around the Social Relief of Distress Grant in terms of determining its future. The budget also proposes above inflation increases to social grants. So all social grants will be increased by inflation, but there are some above inflation increases that are being proposed, which will cost 8.2 billion. And this is also to offset the impact of the 0.5 percentage points increase in VAT that's being proposed. So for example, in the case of the old age pension grant, that grant is going up by 130 Rand per month. And in the case of the child support grant, by 30 Rand per month. There are 70 billion rands in provisional allocations for frontline services. Those are the services that the minister spoke to earlier and will cover on a later slide. And then there are some other spending additions, which we'll also cover later. We are offsetting some of these expenditure additions through reductions in provisional allocations. So for example, the very large reduction in 25-26 in the provisional allocation was a provisional allocation that was put into the budget for the social relief of distress grant. So that is offsetting the 35 billion above the line. And then we are reducing the contingency reserve. So unfortunately, we have much lower buffers in this fiscal framework than we would typically have. We are reducing the contingency reserve by 2.6 billion in 25-26 and almost 10 billion in the outer year. So later on in this presentation, we will take the honourable members through some of the detail of some of these expenditure adjustments. Turning now back to the details on the tax side. On the next slide, we spend a few slides explaining the proposal to Parliament on the VAT rate. So we have considered different options to raise the revenue required in order to cover the expenditure that we have just detailed. We were concerned that increasing personal income tax or corporate income tax would be more negative for employment, savings, investment, and growth than a value-added tax increase. While CIT is imposed on businesses, it is ultimately paid by the people who work there, as well as the shareholders and consumers. And we already have a very high contribution of CIT towards tax revenue. If we look at the second chart, we can see there, relative to the rest of the continent and relative to our OECD peers, corporate income tax as a share of GDP has consistently been much, much higher. However, in contrast, if we compare the VAT rates by country, we can see that the average VAT rate in the OECD countries is around 19%. Ours is currently at 15%, and we can see where some of the other countries fall there as well. On the next slide, we go further to talk about PIT. We do have a very high personal income tax rate as a percent of GDP, as well as a very high top rate at 45%, both of which are much higher than other developing economies, which is what the first chart shows. We also acknowledge, and this has been discussed over the last few weeks, that previous tax rate increases for PIT did not raise the expected revenue, because what taxpayers did was they simply changed their behavior in order to avoid the tax. And in fact, when we increased the top rate to 45%, there was a large reduction in reported taxable income in response to that. Then on the next slide, we talk about what's been done to mitigate the impact of the increase in the VAT rate. The government has proposed direct relief to vulnerable households in the form of above inflation increases to the various social grants. We are also proposing to expand the basket of zero-rated items to include canned vegetables, edible offal, and dairy liquid blends. And however, we do acknowledge that in previous cases, because zero rating is such a blunt tool, the benefits from previous items that were zero rated did not fully pass through to lower income households. But it is clear that the prices did decrease and that there was some benefit, although not fully passed through. And of course, also, there is no proposed increase to the general fuel levy or the road accident fund levy in order to limit the broader impact on cost of living. In the next slide, we just spend a few bullets on the criteria used for VAT zero-rated items additions. The principle that we apply is that we evaluate the requests for zero-rated items against the revenue foregone to the fiscus while keeping an eye on the potential impact on lower-income households. And we focus in particular on the expenditure items that are consumed by the households in expenditure deciles 1 to 4. And we target products that are disproportionately consumed by those households so that we are able to ensure that the maximum benefit of zero rating flows through. And the way we do this is by calculating this equity gain ratio that the slide talks about. So we've proposed some additional items as highlighted in the previous slide, and we believe that these items are well targeted and they will limit the revenue foregone to the fiscus. In total, the additional zero-rated items will cost the fiscus about 2 billion rand per year. The next slide then goes back to articulate some of the details of the spending additions, just to remind ourselves what exactly these tax increases are going to pay for, VAT being one of them. First, as indicated on the infrastructure side, funding of the budget facility for infrastructure window 8 projects. We are also proposing additional funding for disaster management. There are quite a lot of disaster-related infrastructure backlogs in several provinces that have not been addressed over the last few years, and we are proposing that those disaster-related infrastructure backlogs are addressed, and that as an allocation of 4 billion. The Minister spoke about the additions to PRASA, of almost 20 billion over the medium term to deal with signaling. The factory that produces the new trains at the moment has ensured that there are enough new trains on all of the lines, but the challenge is that these trains cannot run often enough to ensure that commuter rail becomes a reliable form of transport. And so the investment in the signaling is what is required to ensure that this takes place. We spoke about the performance grant to turn around trading services in metros. There's a small allocation for the Schools Build program in the Western Cape, as well as a project, Drakenstein project, and then rescheduling of My City, which is rescheduled over the medium term. We spoke about the public service wage agreement, early retirement, social relief of distress, the above inflation increases to social grants, and then there are additional provisional allocations to frontline services, which add up to 70 billion. Provincial education compensation costs and the expansion of early childhood development, which comes to about 30 billion. In health, unemployed doctors, provincial COE and goods and services budgets, 28 billion. In defense and correctional services, additions for compensation of employees. And then in home affairs to strengthen their digitization efforts and employ more individuals.
Order, Chair. Chair,
Who's rising?
Mark Burke from the DA. The finance minister is asleep at the wheel again. Could we please ask him to wake up?
It is unfortunate that I'm not going to entertain such point of orders in this meeting. The meeting is going to be in order. The presentation has been made by the DG, and what you need to be concentrating on is on the presentation from the DG. Thank you very much. I'm not going to take another handoff. Point of orders, we are here for a discussion on the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. The final line item there of 3.2 billion over the medium term is for digitization in Home Affairs, as well as additional employees in the Border Management Authority. The next slide then talks to additional spending items that were already announced at the time of the MTBPS. At the time of the MTBPS, we announced SARS spending adjustments of 3.5 billion over the medium term. The minister announced in his speech that an additional 4 billion is being allocated there to bring the total to 7.5 billion. There's public employment programs, additions to SUNRAL for GFIP, the troop deployment in the DRC, various other spending additions, and then direct charges. And these direct charges are additions mainly for injury on duty and post-retirement medical benefits. Returning now to the tax slide, I think we'll skip this slide in the interest of time. It just covers the revisions to gross tax revenue projections over the medium term. I think what's more important is the next slide, which talks to the very specific tax proposals. These tax proposals will raise 28 billion in 25-26, as well as an additional 14.5 billion in 26-27. What are these tax proposals? Firstly, on the direct taxes side, we are proposing not a rate increase in personal income tax, but we are proposing no inflation readjustment to tax brackets. And that raises an additional 18 billion in the first year, rising to 20 billion in the outer year. What we would typically do in every fiscal framework is we would adjust the SARS tax brackets by inflation so that people don't end up in a higher tax bracket only by virtue of getting an inflationary linked salary increase. If we don't do that, which is what we would typically do, we then raise additional personal income tax, but that of course means in effective terms, the relevant taxpayers are paying more taxes. We are also proposing no inflation readjustment to medical tax credits, which raises an additional 1.5 billion. On the indirect taxes side, as we've indicated previously, we are proposing a 0.5 percentage point increase in VAT in 25-26, which will raise 13.5 billion up to 15 billion in the outer year, and then an additional 0.5 percentage point increase in VAT in 26-27, which of course won't raise any funding this year, and taking effect in 26-27, it will then raise 15.5 billion. We indicated earlier that the zero-rated items will cost around 2 billion, so we are losing revenue there. There's no adjustment to the fuel levy, and because we always assume an inflationary linked adjustment to the fuel levy, that means we are losing 4 billion. There's some diesel refund relief to primary sectors, mainly agriculture, that costs in 26-27 1 billion rand, and then above inflation increases to excise duties on alcohol and tobacco, which will raise 1 billion. And that brings us to a net impact of 28 billion in 25-26, rising to 46 billion, sorry, in 27-28. Just a small point on the personal income tax side. There has been some confusion, including when we've engaged with journalists and economists on the PIT bracket creep relief. There is no inflation readjustment to tax brackets in 25-26, but we assume in this framework that there will be inflation adjustments to tax brackets in 26-27 and 27-28. It's just that the 18 billion from this year flows through over the medium term. So this fiscal framework does assume that next year we will be providing inflationary adjustment to tax brackets. Returning now to the spending side on the next slide, what does that mean? While it means that our consolidated spending will increase from 2.4 trillion to 2.8 trillion in 27-28. Learning and culture over the medium term and on a consolidated basis receives the largest share of expenditure at 1.6 trillion. And we've always raised to this House our concern around debt service costs, which is the second largest item of spending over the medium term at 1.3 trillion, followed by social development and health at 941 billion. In terms of expenditure growth, it's important to highlight the first slide there, that payment for capital assets is the fastest growing item over the medium term at 8.1%. And that again is a very important part of this budget, and the infrastructure reforms being matched by the growth in infrastructure budgets. The second fastest growing item of spending is debt service costs at 7.1%. And that, of course, remains a concern for us, which is why it's so important for us to not fund the additional expenditure from additional borrowing. On the next slide, we then show the consolidated budget balance, and the budget deficit is projected to narrow to 3.5% of GDP by 27-28. The revenue next year will be over 2 trillion at 2.2 trillion in 25-26, while expenditure is 2.6 trillion, giving us a budget deficit of 370 billion. And it's that budget deficit that we need to borrow for, in addition to the redemptions that become due. And that puts a lot of pressure on our gross borrowing requirement, which I will return to later. The next slide then shows the division of revenue over the 2025 MTF. 48.4% of nationally raised revenue is allocated to national government, 41.9% to provinces, and 9.7% to local government. We are announcing quite a few conditional grant reforms in this budget as well, which are aimed at streamlining the conditional grant system, combining different conditional grants, enhancing flexibility in the conditional grant system, and ensuring that we get better value for money out of our conditional grants. Conditional grants are quite important because they activate a lot of the infrastructure service delivery and spending. On the next slide then, almost at the end, Honourable Chairs, the gross borrowing requirement is reducing over the 2025 MTF period. In 25-26, the gross borrowing requirement is 3 billion higher than projected, which partly due to a slightly higher budget deficit, but this is offset by a reduction in the Eskom debt relief. The final Eskom debt relief, which was going to be 70 billion rand, has been reduced now to 50 billion rand, saving the taxpayer 20 billion rand in additional funds that would have gone to Eskom. We are now providing Eskom with 40 billion rand in 25-26 to redeem debt that is maturing in April next year, and then another 10 billion for debt that is maturing in May 2028, adding up to the 50 billion, which is lower than the 70 billion initially penciled in. But it is clear that over the medium term, we are reducing the gross borrowing requirement, certainly for the next 2 years, in particular in terms of our domestic long-term loans, which will come down from 345 billion to 323 billion in 26-27. Next slide shows what does all of this mean for gross loan debt. Gross loan debt will peak at 76.2% of GDP, which is higher than the 75.5% anticipated at the time of the MTBPS. But what's very important is that debt to GDP is still peaking in 25-26, as per our commitment in previous budgets. The next slide talks about state-owned companies and some of the challenges there. There are some areas of green shoots. For example, in Eskom, they are making progress on their recovery plan, although on the finances side, there's room for improvement, and their operational performance also requires improvement. Transnet is still struggling with very high debt levels, and in this budget, 2 additional allocations are being made to Transnet for their Ukuvusilela Auto Corridor, as well as their project at the Cape Town Inland Terminal. And we are working with Transnet on other projects that they may want to submit through the BFI process. But in general, we do have some concerns around the potential impact of state-owned companies and their weakness on the fiscal framework, not only in terms of financial support, but also how their operational activities impact, for example, our ability to generate tax revenue. The next slide then just provides a summary of the fiscal strategy, which I won't go through. If the colleague can then just move to the final slide, which I believe should be here, the one after this, which just talks about the process. We have the committees represented here today, of course, know the process much better than we do, but we thought it's also important, including for the public, to remind ourselves that the process will now begin where the Minister of Finance will work with Parliament to process the budget that has been presented today. This process is governed by the Money Bills and Related Matters Act. And of course, the starting point is that the committees will process the fiscal framework to the National Assembly and NCOP within 16 days or as soon as reasonably possible thereafter. And then, depending on whether the committees accept or amend the fiscal framework, there will then be an engagement process with the Minister of Finance and the National Treasury that is set out there. The annexures to the detailed presentation provided sets out the details of that process and covers both the provisions in terms of the PFMA as well as the Money Bills and Related Matters Act. Very importantly, from 1 April onwards, expenditure is governed by Section 29 of the PFMA, which provides for departments to continue spending in the absence of a passed budget up to 45% of last year's allocations for the first 4 months. But this, of course, does impose limits on the ability of departments to spend any new allocations. That is not provided for in Section 29 of the PFMA. I will leave it there, Honourable Chairs and Honourable Members. Minister, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. Minister, any addition before I know the hands of members? Minister, Deputy Minister, any addition before I know the hands from members?
Give an honourable member. I was worried that Honourable from the didn't clap hands when we showed that we're giving Hassas more money.
Thank you, members. I am going to take a round of hands from the House before noting those that are on the platform for any clarity-seeking question or any comment that may be coming from members. I think it would be better for me to go row by row, starting with Honorable Mkonto going down, and then National Treasury will be noting the questions as they are asked, then later respond. Or I don't know if I should say I should take the first row, they respond, take the second row, they respond, or you want a round of questions. It's better if I take all the questions at a go, and then they'll give responses later. Let me take all the questions in the house, they respond, then I'll give those that on the virtual platform. Over to you, Honorable Mkonto.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning to you, Chair, all the chairs in front there, the Minister and his team, honorable members and colleagues. Chair, my first question will be based on the 28.9 billion allocated to keep 9,300 healthcare workers employed. But in the minister's opening remarks, he said, we were not able to keep 9,000 healthcare workers. Why was this not done in the first place? Because we all know that we have a dire need of health workers in this country. 800 post-community service doctors. Is this going to address the doctors that we saw protesting in the Eastern Cape and in Mpumalanga, that they are qualified, but our government is saying there are no jobs for them? The basic income grant increase of 24 rand per day, that is below real value compared to the 17 rand per day in 2017. With the average 5% average inflation, are we considering the livelihoods of our people, or is just an increase? Because if inflation, the increases don't take into consideration the inflation in the country, then it means there is no real value for those increases. Chair, the last one, we are having 16.9 million unemployed people in South Africa, and predominantly these are young people, graduates, people expected to start independent life, build families, and contribute meaningfully to the economy of the country. The VAT increase that is being proposed has clear time frames that by this time we'll have a 0.5 increase, by this time another 0.5, and it makes 1%. But we don't get a clear and achievable plan for job creation. We can't increase VAT to the unemployed masses of this country. That will be my question, Chair, as to when is the issue of the unemployed youth going to be addressed, and it also in conjunction with the early retirements that we are expecting departments to approve. The 30,000 people that qualify to take early retirement, are we aware that most of these people are breadwinners because their children are seated at home unemployed? Now we want them to take early retirement. We are increasing another unemployment in the country. The building of state capacity, as long as the EFF has been alluding to this matter to say, as long as we are with the tender system, there is no way the building of state capacity is feasible in this country. Engineers and other critical skills are leaving the country because they have realized that they have nothing to contribute to this country. All the infrastructure development that is mentioned here, will be given to tenderpreneurs. So what exactly, how are we going to build the state capacity and be able to be able to provide for our people if critical skills are leaving, people with critical skills are leaving this country, because we have nothing to offer them. Thank you.
Honorable Sibisa.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to all the chairpersons. Greetings, Minister, and your team. It's very disappointing, Minister, that you try to justify the increase of VAT in this book to say that at least South Africa, your VAT rate is very low compared to other countries. So I'm going to give you a scenario, Minister. South Africa versus Sweden. Population of Sweden is 10 million at 10.4% unemployment rate. Population of South Africa is 64.5 million at 33.2% unemployment rate. So we can't just say that at least you are better, your VAT is lower than, and then you don't take into consideration the population and the unemployment rate. Because again, you are saying that we must be grateful that we do not increase the personal income tax, but in reality, it means that the taxpayer is not exonerated from paying tax because it's coming via the increase of the VAT. So there's nothing miraculous about not increasing the personal income tax. There's nothing special about saying that we are increasing the list of non-zero VAT items. Because again, those unemployed, 33.2% people are not exonerated from paying tax one way or the other, whether it's the non-zero VAT items or is the VAT items, they are going to contribute towards the tax in South Africa. So at this moment, Minister, we should be speaking about job creations. We should be speaking about how are we going to sustain South Africa, and in none of everything that you have spoken, is there anywhere where it's spoken about job creations? How this whole thing is going to affect South Africans? Implications, and how does the increase in VAT affect South Africans? It's as long as we don't have job creations, Minister, as long as we don't have means of getting our people to be employed, there's no solution that's going to happen, because even all the money that you've spoken about, it means that we'll have to go and borrow money somewhere. There's no money in South Africa, and that whole thing is going to affect South Africans. Now, Minister, my question would be, what plans do you have, or what are we going to do, or what industries does the Treasury believe will generate jobs? If the government is actively stimulating